Hello, I'm John Ferguson, and very much enjoying being here and having a pleasure here to being with you and being able to talk a little bit about the history of WKY television and my time there. And matter of fact, that was my first job here in Oklahoma City in 1956 as a staff announcer on Channel 4. Now you have to understand that when I went to work there, that was my first job here in Oklahoma City. But let's take the journey from Indiana. I'm not a native Oklahoman. I was born and raised in the small town of Clinton, Indiana, and was born on February 17th, 1928. And I grew up there, and one thing about it is I read my mom's movie magazines. I graduated from high school in '45, went into the Navy right after that, had a short trip into the Navy, got out, and went to college and met a girl, lost a girl, and decided that I'd like to leave, and I went to Hollywood, California, because as I said, I read my mom's movie magazines. I wanted to go to Hollywood. I never was a big guy. Matter of fact, I was a very small guy all through high school. So I wasn't good at play athletics or anything like that. So anyway, I traveled with the dog show. I really did. His name was Ernest Presley. He had 9 dogs, and he taught traffic safety with high school and grade school kids come through there. And I was working in a clothing store, and his assistant got sick, had to leave, and people came in and said, "Hey, you like show business? You want to do this?" And I did, and I traveled with him for about 2 or 3 months. And exactly doing that gave me enough money to go to Hollywood, California. And of course, I told people that was my first paid professional job in show business, because I truly learned what the jargon of show business was about when they said, "Clean up the act." And I truly did know what clean up the act, because every time we stopped, I cleaned up the act after 9 dogs. Yes, I did. But I loved it. So anyway, that gave me money, went to Hollywood, hooked up with a little theater group out there called the Highland Playhouse of Dramatic Art, did 3 stage shows and got lucky, and they had an entrance into the San Gabriel Mission Playhouse plays, 1-act plays, and I ended up winning a Best Supporting Actor award, but certainly didn't do me any good in Hollywood, not at that time. Met and married a girl from Oklahoma. She was recovering from a heart surgery and rehabbing out there. And that was in the summer of 1953. Well, by the fall, September, we were heading back to Tulsa, married, and I was living in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Met a fellow by the name of Bill McMillan, who was working at KVOO radio at that time. And he knew that I had radio background, been in Hollywood, so he encouraged me to go on the radio. And so I ended up at a 250-watt radio station, KBIX Muskogee, for my first radio job in 1954. And then soon, about a little bit within a year, they had Griffin Grocery Company put on a television station called KTVX. And I auditioned, got a job there. And that was in September of '55. Well, in the meantime, my friend Bill McMillan had come over to Oklahoma City and was working at Channel 4. And by December, he called me and said, "Come on over. Thursday, we're going to have an audition." I said, "Okay." So I drove over there, and lucky enough, I got the job, became a staff announcer in 1956, January. And there were about 10 gentlemen on staff already. I was supposed to be the gopher. In other words, all with Maury Ferguson, Bill Fountain, Danny Williams, Steve Powell, Foreman Scotty, Ben Morris, Tom Paxton. These were the stars. This television was big, and WKY-TV was one of the biggest for the market size, was probably one of the top NBC stations in the country. And there I was with about 15 or 16 months experience. And I was a staff announcer. I just came in the morning, come back at late night, whatever, because these television advertising was expanding and programming was expanding, so the demand for all these great guys that have all this talent were busy doing commercials, because everything was live, no videotape or anything else, only film. So they were busy, and they had to be there. So I filled the station breaks, the time they had to do other little programs or whatever. And one of the best shows on television at that time was The Adventures of 3D Danny Williams, who was a mainstay in this market and been there and had done all different programs for Channel 4. He was a star celebrity. But he had the afternoon kids show with Foreman Scotty, Steve Powell. And I really wanted to be on that show, but there was no need. There was another gentleman there, one of the best announcers in the world, was named Hy Roberts. He's gone. But he was one of the best announcers. He'd been in Hollywood. Matter of fact, when he was in Hollywood when he was 15 years old, and did a movie with Mickey Rooney and Judy Garland and Babes in Arms. And now he got tired of that, and he came back to Oklahoma, which is home with his family. and he was there. Great announcer, and he played one of the parts on the Danny's show at that time and doing some of the bad guys and stuff like that. He was a great voice, do a lot of voice work and dialects and everything else. Well, all of a sudden he gets a little upset with whatever and decides to go to Albuquerque and take a job there, and he left the station. So I saw an opportunity, and having stage makeup and everything, I mentioned to Danny that I had an idea for a show, but Danny was always so preoccupied and busy because he had so many things going, and I was just, if you want to put it in this sense, that like I said, there were 10 guys, there's 10 staff announcers. Well, sometimes I felt like I was number 12 because I had no persona, no identity, because these guys were the stars. I was just there. So I went back and I did the makeup and I created a villain, kind of based on the old mean character in Buck Rogers series, but I exaggerated it a little bit, and the face and the eyebrows. So I had these pictures made. Well, about 4 or 5 days after I'd mentioned Danny about a character, he approached me. I was in the radio doing a little fill-in radio show there at 12:30 in the afternoon, and he opened the door and came in and kind of really said, John got on me about talking about the show, and he needed a son to do something because he had a show to do. And I just said, Danny, there's some pictures. So he went back over and took a look at the pictures, and I won't say, can't repeat what he said, but he disappeared. And about 20 minutes later, he came back and said, you are on the show. And that's exactly what changed my life and my career at WKY-TV and being here in Oklahoma, really. Well, Danny asked about being on the show, and based on those pictures, so I became the villain. He introduced me, and he came up with the name, the Duke of Mukeden. And that's kind of close when you think about today's life, about the nukes and everything, but it was the Duke of Mukeden. And I became the arch enemy of Danny Williams. And actually, it was fit in perfectly, size-wise, character-wise for us. It just worked. The chemistry of it was just beautiful. Well, then I stepped into the Bazark, and I was Bazark. And then he created another character to being a good guy, and I became Ubick. And I described Ubick as, Ubick was to 3D Danny what Spock was to Kirk. But we were way ahead of our time. So that was another role I did. And there was Bazark. Oh, excuse me. But there were so many other roles. I created a lot of different makeup, a lot of different characters. And that was in 1956 when this all happened, mid-late 1956. And that 3 years before Danny left to go full-time in radio, I probably did 30 to 35, 40 characters. We just lost track because of all the different things we did, because Danny was just a creative genius with that show. And that show was only 1 or 2 stations in the country that outrated and had higher ratings and beat the Mickey Mouse Club across the nation. And then Steve Powell was Foreman Scotty, and with the kids there. And so he started merging him into more of the action series. And then within 3 years, when Danny took a full-time job at radio, then Steve Powell took over the Circle 4 Ranch, and I stayed with it, created another character, and I became White Cloud, an Indian friend of Foreman Scott, is still doing the show. But there were a lot of changes going on at that time, even though I was still working there at full-time. Changes were coming around, and the little recession hit, and I was out of the job as an announcer at that time and working with the promotion department. But I had another job offering, and I went out to Frontier City when it first opened in 1958 and did those shows. But in 1958, something also changed at Channel 4 at that time, more importantly, because based on the character that I did, that villain, the Duke of Mukeden, in 1958, they came to me and said, could you create a character for a horror show, horror films? And I said, well, yeah. You know, and I started reading about it, and this was kind of a phenomenon. It was going across in the big markets and everything, late night television. And it was John Zachary, who I kind of looked at and found out what he was doing in Philadelphia as Roland, and the package was called Shock. It was the old Universal pictures that they had done, the Frankensteins, the Wolfman, the Invisible Man, and the Bride of Frankenstein, and all of those great old movies. So they packaged all those together so they could run late night, and they called it Shock Theater, and most of the television stations were all developing late night movie hosts. Well, I got lucky. They asked me to do it. Did the makeup, got the costume and everything, and on May the 10th, Saturday night, 1958, at 11:30, which was a late night television show, I came on right after live wrestling, and of course, there was Danny Williams hosting late night television, late night wrestling, and his cue was when they went off, watch out for flying chairs. And I hear that anywhere I go today, people remember that. And after that, I would step forth in the camera, and I looked at the camera and said, good evening. I'm Count Gregore, and this is Shock Theater. We do hope that you will stay tuned tonight. We have a very great movie for you. Do not go in. Lock your doors. Be secure. We went into the movie. And I don't know if you remember. You remember what the first night, if you were old enough and watched? The first movie we ran was Lon Chaney and the Wolfman. And we ran that package for that about 2 years. Remember, they also told me it was only going to be a 2-year run simply because of the movie contracts. Well, they did go right through the 2 years. Well, also then, as I repeated earlier, that they had a little recession, so I was out of a job. And they also had replaced me on the Shock Theater with Tom Paxton. And so I was still at Frontier City and still doing the Danny Williams, the 3D Danny show. Well, about 5 or 6 weeks now. This was all happening when I was just the job. I was out of the job at that time. It was about July of '58. So I'd only been on the air with Count Gregore since May. Now I was off the air. So I go to Frontier City doing the gunfight shows. In about 6 weeks, so one of the station personnel came out and said, approached me about coming back because they had had so many calls, so many complaints and letters and the whole thing going in that time period. They said, we got to have that character back, which was very flattering to me. So anyway, Count Gregore came back on the air. And so I filled out to the time right after that point in time to about 1960. And I left. I left the station, and in that period of time, I was doing some other things. The main thing I did was I did end up at Norwick Brothers because I knew them and I got a job in sales. And so proceeded on with that, I was out of broadcasting at that point in time. And then they also, Channel 4 in 1962, they brought the old NBC series of, it was called Thriller, and Boris Karloff hosted it. It was late night prime time, and it ran for about 2 years. Well, now it all went off the air, and they put it all in syndication, which means they just took all those shows, started selling them independently to local television shows across the country just to fill in some program time. And so Channel 4 bought it, put it on the air at midnight and Saturday nights. And I called and said, hey, how about Count Gregore coming back? Nah, I don't think so. We're just going to run it as is. I said, okay. Well, they had the first rating period, which was in November. And I happened to meet the national sales manager in the bank one day, just talking with him. He asked what I was doing. I said I was in sales at Norwick Brother. He said, oh, did they maybe the station calling you and ask you about coming back on the air? And I said, well, no. I said, I told them in September they didn't want to use Count Gregore. He said, John, the ratings were so bad, they might be calling you because and we got a 2-year contract. And I can't sell it because you know national sales, I need rating numbers, and there are none. Well, by accident or coincidence, I had a station call to go into the business office, and because they had bought their forms from Norwick Brothers, and I happened to be the sales guy. And when I walked by and said hi to the program director, before I could get away, I heard my name called, and I went back in there, and sure enough, he said, how about coming back on the air? So I went back on the air, and this was about mid-January when I went on. The ratings were in February, and I got a call from the station that said, thank you, the rating numbers came ruddy up and everything was fine. So I had to fill that out for the next 2 years. By coincidence, I ran into Nick Panis, who was the national sales manager for Channel 4 in the bank, and we were just talking, and all of a sudden he said, well, has the station called you about bringing Count Gregore back? And I said, well, no. I said, when I asked them in September just if they could use Count Gregore, and they said, no, they're just going to run it intact. I said, what happened? He said, John, in the book, rating books in November came out, and I said, hardly any numbers. I mean, the show was just dead. And he said, I can't sell the show because, you know, I'm national advertisers, they want rating numbers, then there are none. And he said, I thought they were going to talk to you. And I said, well, I haven't heard anything yet. But he said, well, if they do, don't tell them we had this conversation. I said, no, I won't. Well, again, strangely enough, about 3 days later, I had a phone call from the business office at Channel 4, and they needed to replace some stationery and forms and like that, and I happened to be the salesman, so I was out there and got the order. As I walked by, and I said hello to Joe Jerkins, who's the program director. I said, how are you doing? And just walked on, and I thought, I wonder if he's... I stopped for just a few seconds out past his door, and sure enough, I heard my name. He called me. So I went back into his office to talk to him. So he said, what are you doing? So we had just a little conversation, and all of a sudden he said, well, maybe think about bringing Count Gregore back to put on the Thriller show. And I said, really? I said, well, gee whiz. I said, didn't do that before. I'm glad we're going to do it. So anyhow, we reached an agreement and found one thing about it, for the money and get what I'd like to do, what we could do with it, work with it. And so I said, okay. And to get it back on the air immediately, because the ratings month was coming up in February, and now it's the middle of January. So actually, I went back on the air in January and only had 2 weeks before the rating period. And so that's in February. So the February, get into rating period, the rating period's over, and the rating books will not be out to the stations for about 3.5 or 4 weeks. So I forgot all about that because I'm still now employed by North Brothers. And then one afternoon in March, I get a phone call, and I answered the phone and said, hello, it's North Brothers. And it was Nick Panis. And he said, thanks. Thank you, baby. I said, what? He said, John. He said, thanks. He said, the rating books are out. Man, it jumped up there. The numbers are there. We got great numbers. I think we're almost #1 at that time. We jumped up. It's amazing. He said, thank you. So we can now sell the show. Well, I wasn't smart enough to say, go back and say, hey, well, I jumped your ratings. I need some more money. But, that's how it works in the local market. And I didn't care. I enjoyed being Count Gregore, enjoyed the show. And the fact, again, proving one thing, that when I went off the air, they took me off the air in that 58 and 59, and they said they got calls and complaints. I went back on the air, and there's a show now that's not doing well in the ratings, and all of a sudden I'm back and the ratings go up. And that one thing right there tells me and proved to me all my life that the fan base out there, and for that character, Count Gregore, was something that was so special, because in those two instances proved to me, and I've since learned a lot of ways, how important the fans out there. And that's just not saying words. That's just proof of what fans can do, and how lucky, how blessed I have been all these many years, sitting right here to now in 2011. That is starting out in 1958 and being able to talk about being Count Gregore, all because of that fan base and support I've had all these many years and meeting those people today. But it was so much fun then when I was doing the shows. And again, I talk about the number of people out there that was so important, just those early days of television. It never happened. I just tell people, I sort of just parachuted in the back door of WKY-TV, not even knowing kind of what I was doing or where I was, and how important that was, and to be around and to work those people, and especially Danny Williams, who gave me the opportunity to get on his show, because that is what changed my life and career from that show, creating a villain, from a villain to Count Gregore, and from Count Gregore on into other things. So it's been that important to me, and how important people. Bill McMillan, as I said, he's the one that got me there. Danny Williams put me on the show. And then had all these people who would find Bill Thrash. We talked about doing things live, live shows, live television, and we were not even allowed to use teleprompters or anything. We had to memorize the radio commercial, the TV commercials, whatever. But even when we did the programs, remember, when it went on the air and said Saturday night, May 10th, 1958, said good evening, Shock Theater, we were live. So when the movie The Wolfman ran, that time, I went up and watched the movies, and the director, and we were then starting to plan. We had about 10 or 12, 15 minutes for the first break coming up. From that point, we started planning out what we were going to do. Now, the director probably had seen the movie or watched the movie, I think, during the week sometime. So he had an idea a little bit what was going on. I hadn't seen it. So anyway, we went down and we actually took that 15 minutes and we would create what the next break was going to be. Because we'd see the movie, could lift something out of the movie, make a prop, and we'd have the props or find a prop or make a prop. Or I could talk about the story a little bit and just the plot of it. And maybe an arm would come in and grab me or something. We always had something prior to the break of watching the movie. And we did it that night. So every break that we did was live. And I know one time Had a movie about an art. Some of the movies weren't all that great, but we had one. This movie, it had something to do with artwork or painter and all of this. And I had my friends, because I was at that time still out at Frontier City. And I had my gunfight friends, and we brought them in one night, and they were like art critics. And I had this big pot. We used a lot of dry ice and smoke and anything like that. And we had a picture frame, and we had the Invisible Man. So we did things all at that time. Remember, all while the movie was going on. Well, this one particular instance, we got the guys out there and had them as art critics. And they didn't like my paintings, so after a little drink, they took a little drink, and that was it. So we had 10 of them. So we went to the next studio. Now, that was Studio C. Over there was empty. So we had them all set up like bowling alley in pins, and I had a bowling ball in my hand against the wall. The shot was where I was going to roll up and roll the ball down like it was the ghouling alley. And there was a commercial, Vicks was running at that time, a 60-second commercial. And we ran it in the show all the time. The guy was up there, you saw him roll the ball down to the bowling alley, hit the strike, and he'd look up and said, "Would you believe it? I have a cold." Well, we decided to give our own little intro. So I wrote the bowling ball and then rolled it down very slowly, and luckily it was rolling right down. The camera shot, just went right down, rolled right up to the first guy. They all hit the bang and made the sound, and sound effects like pins were going over, and went right into the commercial. Would you believe it? I have a cold. We used to do that to lead into the commercial so people wouldn't just tune out. So a lot of times what we were planning is what the next break coming up was commercial, how we could tie into it. And another time we had a sandbox and a hand, and the commercial's coming out, and we cut the sandbox, and here was a product and a hand coming out into the commercial. So we were always thinking about what we could do, not just from the show, how we could take the show to the live break and into the commercials. So that was our plot and plan all the time of what we could do, how creative we could be to do that. The Invisible Man, we had black drapes. We took a boom mic and stretched it across and wrapped a black curtain down, had somebody on one side. I had these high school guys out of class. They were out there every time. One guy worked out of Frontier City. Worked with Pipkin Photos, and he was a photographer, 18 years old. And his buddies, and they would come out to the station every Saturday night especially when I was still working in the Frontier City. I had to leave there about 10:15. I had a show to do. Drive as fast as I could get out to Channel 4, clean up, get my makeup on, and be ready to walk at the show at 11:30. And remember, I hadn't seen anything. That 1 hour time I got out there, it was after I did the intro, introduced the movie, and then in that 15 minutes, start thinking about what we were going to do for the rest of the night, do a show. So it was very spontaneous. And all that happened with so many people out there helping me out. And I remember when we did The Invisible Man, I had I put a black drape over my head, I wrapped it in bandages. And so I had to take it off, but I could not put my hand across my face, or I would just be a hole there. And I had to unwrap it. Of course, when I unwrapped it correctly, take the bandage off, there you couldn't see me, but you saw this other face moving or the body moving. So all that was created at those times in that 15 to 20 minutes, 12 minutes, whatever time we had to do that show. And that was what was so great about that time, because it was spontaneous, it was creative, and had people coming out to help. And Channel 4, they loved to do that, the production guys, because a lot of times they were just doing straight stuff, shooting the news and other programs. This was an actual like shooting a movie almost. Everybody threw in. And that's what made it work. All those people would just come out there and be there with me. And that continued on just from there. And I came back on vacation with my wife. We went to Tulsa, and we came back into Oklahoma City, visited Channel 4, and saw all my buddies. There they were in sales and all this. And it was just great, and talked about being in Cincinnati. He said, "How come you left there?" So anyway, talked about it. I left, came back to Cincinnati with about 5 or 6 weeks. Came in and answered my phone one day and said, "Hi, this is John Ferguson." I said, "This is Bill Thrash." I said, "Hi, Bill." Well, it was Bill Thrash calling from Channel 4, saying about a job opening, because another fellow had, not only had the sales manager resign, another gentleman had left the station to go over to Channel 9, by the way. And so they were calling me, and then Mr. Norman Bagwell, who was the general manager, talked to me, and they said, "We'd like for you to come back to Channel 4. You think I'm going to say no? Are you kidding me? I was so glad, and my family, to come back, and they were happy. So we came back to Channel 4, number 1, 73 is when I first got back. It was 1973 to start the year. And Bill Thrash was there as the program director. Bill Thrash came up to me and said, well, guess what? You're going to be on Saturday night at midnight. And I said, we don't have that many old horror films, but I got a lot of comedy. I got Groucho Marx. I got W.C. Fields. I got, who else? The comedy team of, I can't think of the names right now. Anyway, I'll think about them. But in other words, just a few horror flicks. But he said, I think we can make it work. And he said, I found this old slide that years and years ago when I was even watching television late night when they were running old movies called Sleepwalkers Matinee. And I found that slide. He said, I think this is great. He said, I just love that. And he said, we'll call it Sleepwalkers Matinee. And we used the theme song called Rubber Ducky. So everything was kind of lighthearted and what it was, it changed from what it was. And you know what? It did work. It worked like magic. All in color, great production. And I had my buddies come along, Dr. Digby, George Meckling, who I did stage shows with over there at the Jewel Box. And he one night, they told me at rehearsal, he had this ape mask and a dark brown coat and all of this jazz and gloves. So he showed up to the show one night, said maybe a little bit, and next thing we know, stuck him in a barrel. He started hitting me as I started leaving the show, and I said, I'm tired of this. Where did you come from anyway? Oh, he wouldn't talk, just the guttural sounds. But he was just great. So I had a gunny sack, and I said, here, I picked up the gunny sack, and why don't you just hit the sack tonight, and I'll leave you alone. And that's where it started. And he was there, and Mr. Ape became a vital part of that show. And again, how many people came up to me and said, hey, I got an idea, come on. That was always the energy, the juice that kept the show going and made new blood and gave us things to work with. And then the production guys out there, that from Jerry Rogers, who directed it and at that time, and I go clear back again to the first time we started when Harry Apel was the director, and he ended up being the general manager of a television station for Oklahoma Publishing Company in Tampa. There was George Dalney and Don Garrison and just so many people at those times. A lot of them are gone. But I have been blessed all that time at Channel 4. Everything in my life centered around Channel 4, from things that happened to me, not just there, from past that time. But Jerry Rogers was a director, and I mean, he put his heart and soul into that show. But Jerry was also the director and the producer for Danny Williams' afternoon show, Danny's Day. So I ended up with him as my producer-director, which was great because he loved the show. And we had such a good crew. The guys, when we taped the show, we're no longer live. So what we would do, we would take 2 shows. We'd tape 2 shows every 2 weeks. So in other words, we'd tape 4 shows, another one, 2 shows, 2 tape sessions twice a month, which we do 2 shows each time for the month. And so we had all the stage crew and so many of the news guys, when we would tape at 7 o'clock, and so many production guys would just come over, not having to work on my show. We already had our cameraman, but they all threw in to make the show even better. And so it'd say Jerry Rogers was the director. Then we had 2 guys show up, Mike Hingston and Charlie Brown, and they became Harold and Wesley. Now this is long before Daryl and Daryl ever showed up in Bob Newhart's show, but that was the type of characters they were. And they were talented musicians, but here they were doing these old clothes and old stuff and just funny as they could be. Had Dr. Digby, had George Meckling as the Mr. Ape, and had just a number of people would come in from everywhere, shows. We just had a lot of guests on. Matter of fact, had guests at that time. Dick Sargent from Bewitched, that had Bob Cummings, a long-time major movie star in the 40s, and had his own television show in the early days, and Van Johnson, who's a super major star in the late 40s. If you watch late night shows, you will see those people. But those are the type of people who were coming through it and even stopping by and doing my show. Well, that lasted, I was 70 when I went on the air in 73 when I got back, and we were on there till July of 1979 doing those shows called Sleepwalkers Matinee. With all those great people and helping out so much, I mean, Sleepwalkers Matinee, I wish I could just tell you how much some of the great shows, wish we had videotapes, and unfortunately we did, but I have some of my greatest memories of that time period when Bill Thrash said, put us on Saturday nights in 1973. Now, unbeknownst and unknown at that time when we went on air in 73 and all the happy times we were having on Channel 4, WKY-TV, things were about to change once more in the industry of television, because in 1975, Channel 4 was sold. And that was the end of WKY-TV. This is Count Gregore, thanking you so much for all these many years. And I do hope you have a lot of happy nightmares.